The conference room lights burned too bright, reflecting off the glass walls like interrogation lamps. Ethan Cross, our brilliant, untouchable CEO, strode in, his smile rehearsed, his confidence radiating like a politician on stage. He didn't know yet. On the table in front of him lay a manila folder. I had slid it there seconds earlier. Inside, evidence no one could laugh off, spin, or bury under. Charm. Funny thing about presents, Ethan, I said, my voice steady even though my heart hammered against my ribs. It doesn't multiply. You can't be in two places at once. His grin faltered. Brian shifted uncomfortably beside me. Moments ago, he'd sworn Ethan was in his office that morning, dedicated as always. But my sister, Captain Priya Patel, had whispered to me over the phone, her voice like a razor blade through static. That's impossible. I'm watching him right now, boarding a flight out of O'Hare, and he's not alone. Now, the photos spilled across the glass table. Ethan's face stared back from two realities, one striding into a jet bridge, hand on a woman's shoulder. The other, minutes later, walking into this very room, pale and trembling as the lies collapsed. Humiliation wasn't, gradual. It was instant. That moment, the exact second when Ethan Cross realized he'd been caught, replays in my mind like a film clip I can't erase. His eyes darted from the photos to me, then around the room at the board members whose respect he'd cultivated for years. In one breath, his carefully constructed world began to unravel. But let me back up. Before I became the woman who brought down Chicago's most charismatic CEO, I was just Naomi Patel, 32, risk analyst at Stratagem Analytics. I wasn't flashy. I wasn't loud. I was the person you'd overlook at company parties, the one in the corner running the models, catching the small discrepancies, making sure our billion-dollar clients trusted us. Ethan liked to call me our invisible net. He'd smile in town halls and say, Naomi's the one who makes sure we don't fall. The irony doesn't escape me now. I believed in him. Ethan Cross, the man who built Stratagem from a basement startup into one of the Midwest's most respected analytics firms. He loved the spotlight, but he also had this knack for making you feel seen, like you were part of something bigger than yourself. That Tuesday morning in October began like any other. Chicago's wind whipped between skyscrapers, sending fallen leaves dancing across Michigan Avenue. I ducked into lakefront roasters, grateful for the warmth and the rich scent of espresso that enveloped me like an old friend. The usual, Naomi? Asked Elin, the barista who knew most Loop regulars by name. Please, could use the extra shot today. Board meeting? She asked, steaming milk. With practiced ease. I nodded, checking my phone. 3 emails from Brian, our enthusiastic SVP of marketing, confirming final presentation details. He'd attached a photo of Ethan already at work in his office, captioned, Boss is a machine, first in as always. That's when my phone vibrated with an incoming call. Priya never called during shifts unless it was urgent. My sister had been flying commercial jets for 8 years, her discipline as precise as her uniform. Naomi, she whispered, her voice carrying that slight echo of an aircraft cockpit. Quick question, is your boss in the office? The question seemed odd. Yes, I said automatically. Brian just texted. He swears Ethan was in by 7. Coat on his chair, lights on. Why? That's impossible, she said, her tone clipped but unmistakably troubled. I'm literally watching him board my flight to DC Gate K-12. And he's not alone. Not alone. That phrase lodged in my chest like a stone. Priya, are you sure it's him? Navy suit, that red tie he wore to Mom's birthday dinner, leather messenger bag, and that walk like he owns the runway. It's him, Naomi. I stepped outside, coffee forgotten, staring north toward O'Hare as, if I could somehow see through the miles of concrete and steel. Who's with him? Blonde woman, early 30s. They're close. Very close. The implications hung between us. Ethan was married to Catherine, a pediatric surgeon whose charitable foundation was as much a part of Stratagem's brand as our analytics. Their picture-perfect marriage graced Chicago social pages regularly. Naomi, I've got to go. Pre-flight checks, but I'll send you something. Just be careful with it. The call ended just as my phone pinged with a notification. Priya had sent photos, discreet, captured at an angle that wouldn't be obvious to the subjects, but clear enough. There was no mistaking Ethan's profile, his hand resting possessively on the small of the blonde woman's back as they handed boarding passes. To the gate agent. Timestamp, 7:43 a.m. I zoomed in on the woman's face, but didn't recognize her. She wasn't Catherine, She wasn't anyone from the office. She was a complete stranger with an intimate connection to my boss. The same boss who, according to Brian, was already working diligently at Stratagem headquarters. When I arrived at the office 20 minutes later, the morning bustle was in a full swing. Our glass tower on Wacker Drive hummed with the energy of people who believed they were changing the world one data point at a time. I nodded to security, swiped my badge, and headed for the 32nd floor. Brian greeted me with his trademark enthusiasm. "There she is, our numbers wizard. Ethan was asking for you earlier." My stomach clenched. "Was he? When was that?" "About 30 minutes ago." "You just missed him," Brian said, his expression open and guileless. "He's a machine. First in, last out." I kept my face neutral despite the knowledge burning in my pocket. "Any idea where he is now?" "I think he mentioned running to a breakfast meeting nearby. Back for the board presentation at 11. 11 o'clock. The flight to DC would be in the air by then. Something wasn't adding up. And if there's one thing that makes a risk analyst uncomfortable, it's numbers that don't balance. Over the next 2 weeks, the inconsistencies began to multiply like fractures in thin ice. I started small, checking badge logs against surveillance footage. Ethan's keycard had swiped at the office at 7:12 that Tuesday morning, but when I reviewed the security feeds, borrowed discreetly from my friend in IT, no one had entered. The timestamp showed an empty lobby during those critical minutes. Then came the expense reports. 3 vendor payments had been signed off by Ethan during a week he was supposedly in Singapore for the Asian Finance Summit. The digital signatures were legitimate. The system required 2-factor authentication that would have sent codes to his personal phone. Most disturbing were what I began to think of as presence validations. Decisions justified by his being in the room that, when checked against his actual whereabouts, couldn't possibly have happened. Ethan was there when we decided on the Miller acquisition terms. Our CFO had insisted when questions arose about the unusual structure. The severance package was personally reviewed by Ethan, HR, told a departing employee whose compensation seemed suspiciously reduced. I cleared it with Ethan yesterday. Became the corporate equivalent of divine approval. Unquestionable, uncheckable. It wasn't just about being in 2 places at once. It was about using presence as a shield, a kind of corporate magic trick. If Ethan was there, no one questioned, no one audited, no one looked too closely at, decisions that benefited specific vendors, consultants, or allies. I needed someone I could trust, someone with both access and discretion. Monica Reyes, our general counsel, had been with Stratagem since before Ethan took over. Her reputation for uncompromising ethics made her both respected and slightly feared throughout the company. "I need 15 minutes, I told her assistant, who glanced at Monica's packed schedule with skepticism. "It's important," I added, lowering my voice. "It's about Ethan." 10 minutes later, I sat across from Monica in her corner office. Chicago's skyline stretched behind her, gray clouds gathering over Lake Michigan. "Naomi," she said, her expression neutral but attentive. "What's this about?" I laid out what I'd discovered, keeping my voice steady and factual. Monica listened without interruption, her dark eyes revealing nothing. When I finished, she remained silent, fingers steepled beneath her chin. "You understand what you're suggesting," she finally said. It wasn't a question. "I do. And your evidence?" I slid a USB drive across her desk. "Everything I've collected, badge logs, timestamp inconsistencies, expense approvals during documented absences, and my sister's sworn statement as a commercial pilot, plus the photographs." Monica picked up the drive, weighing it in her palm as if measuring its potential impact. "Naomi, presence can't be a substitute for truth. If you can prove this pattern, you don't just catch him, you protect the entire company." Her expression softened slightly. "But Ethan's grip on this organization is tight. People like Brian don't just admire him, they define themselves through his approval." "I know," I said, thinking of Brian's eager face, his constant praise of Ethan's work ethic. He's built a cult of personality. More than that, he's built a system where questioning him feels disloyal, even dangerous. Monica's gaze sharpened. "Are you prepared for what happens if you're right?" The Todds. Question hung between us. Was I ready to potentially bring down the company's charismatic leader? The man who'd built Stratagem from nothing? The man who'd mentored me, promoted me, trusted me with increasingly complex responsibilities? "I'm a risk analyst," I said finally. "My job is to identify threats to the company's integrity. This qualifies." Monica nodded once, decisive. "I'll review these." Materials tonight. In the meantime, continue as normal. Don't alert him. There's one more thing, I added. Ethan's called an all-hands meeting at the Wabash Executive Loft tomorrow. He wants to showcase new leadership wins. Interesting timing, Monica mused. Perhaps we should prepare a showcase of our own. That night, I couldn't sleep. My apartment overlooking Millennium Park normally soothed me with its view of the city lights, but everything looked different now. Each glittering window represented someone who might be living a double life, someone whose public image was carefully constructed fiction. My phone buzzed at 1:37 a.m. A text from Priya. Just landed in Chicago. Still sure about tomorrow? I typed back. No, but necessary. I'll be there, she replied, then added, You're doing the right thing. But what was the right thing? Exposing Ethan meant potentially damaging Stratagem, the company I'd helped build for 7 years. It meant risking relationships with colleagues who might view me as a traitor. It meant stepping out of the shadows into a spotlight I'd never sought. As dawn broke over Lake Michigan, I made my decision. I packed the presentation I'd prepared into my briefcase alongside the manila folder containing the most damning evidence. Today, Ethan Cross would learn that presence, true presence, meant facing consequences, not avoiding them. By the time I arrived at the Wabash Executive Loft, the executive team was already gathering. Brian greeted me with his usual enthusiasm, though I noticed the slight shadows under his eyes. Big day, he said, straightening his tie. Ethan's been working around the clock on this presentation. Game changer, he says. I smiled tightly. I believe it will be. The conference room filled quickly. Board members in expensive suits, department heads checking last-minute emails, administrative staff arranging coffee and pastries that no one would touch. Monica arrived precisely 5 minutes before the scheduled start, catching my eye with the slightest nod. She had reviewed the evidence. She was ready. At exactly 10 Mayars a.m., Ethan Cross strode in, confidence preceding him like a herald. His smile was brilliant, his navy suit impeccable, his presence, that carefully cultivated aura of success and certainty, filling the room. Good morning, everyone, he began, his voice carrying that perfect blend of authority and approachability. Today marks a new chapter for Stratagem. He didn't see Monica's slight gesture to me, didn't notice as I silently placed the manila folder on the table before him. Funny thing about presence, Ethan, I said, my voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through me. It doesn't multiply. You can't be in 2 places at once. And that's when everything changed. Time suspended itself in that glacial moment. Ethan frozen mid-smile, the board members shifting uncomfortably in their seats, Brian's face draining of color. The only sound was the soft hum of the ventilation system and the distant honking of taxis on Wabash Avenue below. I pressed the remote in my hand. The projection screen behind Ethan flickered to life, displaying a split screen. On the left, Ethan boarding a flight at O'Hare, time-stamped 7:43 a.m., 2 Tuesdays ago. On the right, his badge access log showing entry to Stratagem headquarters at 7:12 a.m., the same morning. Would you like to explain how you managed this particular feat? I asked, my voice steadier than I felt. Ethan's recovery was impressive. I'll give him that. His smile dimmed only slightly as he glanced at the screen. Then, back to the room. There seems to be some confusion, he said smoothly. Naomi, perhaps we should discuss this privately after the presentation. I don't think so, Monica interjected, rising from her seat at the far end of the table. These discrepancies warrant immediate attention. I advanced to the next slide. This isn't an isolated incident, I continued, addressing the room rather than, Ethan. Over the past 6 months, there have been at least 17 documented instances where Ethan's physical presence was claimed in one location, while evidence confirms he was elsewhere. Murmurs rippled through the room. I could feel Brian's stunned gaze on me, but I kept my focus on the presentation. This isn't about your personal choices, I said firmly, my eyes finally locking on Ethan's. This is about systemic misrepresentation, about presence laundering, using your supposed attendance to rubber stamp decisions that never had proper scrutiny. The next slide showed expense reports approved during Ethan's documented absence in Singapore. Then came statements from employees citing his presence at meetings he couldn't possibly have attended. The pattern suggests a deliberate system, I continued, where your physical presence, or the illusion of it, is used to validate decisions without actual oversight. Ethan's charm offensive began in earnest then. He laughed, that disarming chuckle that had won over investors and employees alike. This is quite the presentation, Naomi. I appreciate your thoroughness. It's why you're such an asset to our team. But there are, simple explanations for each of these apparent discrepancies. Travel plans change. Digital signatures can be pre-authorized. As for that particular Tuesday, you were boarding a flight to DC with a woman who wasn't your wife. I finished for him. While simultaneously, according to Brian and others, working diligently in your office. Brian flinched beside me, the realization dawning that he had been used, his admiration for Ethan weaponized to perpetuate a fiction. Who authenticated your presence here that morning, Ethan? I asked. Who told everyone you were in early, working hard as always? Because the security footage shows no one entering the building using your badge, despite the log entry. The atmosphere in the room had shifted. What began as confusion was crystallizing into something else, a collective recognition that something fundamental had been breached. My sister is Captain Priya Patel, I said, gesturing to the back of the room where Priya stood in her pilot's uniform, having come directly from her overnight flight. She was the pilot on United 242 to Washington, D.C. that morning. She has provided a sworn statement confirming your boarding, along with these photographs. Ethan's facade finally cracked. His eyes darted around the room, measuring allies and enemies, calculating his next move. I'd seen that look before, when a particularly complex risk analysis revealed an unexpected vulnerability. It was the look of someone recalculating odds in real time. The board has reviewed these documents, Monica said, delivering the final blow. Effective. Immediately, your access to stratagem systems and premises is revoked. We'll proceed through proper governance channels from here. Ethan tried once more to smile, to spin, to charm. But the photos, the logs, the evidence, they were heavier than his words could lift. This is a misunderstanding that I can clear up immediately, he insisted, but his voice had lost its magnetic quality. If we could. Just, security is waiting to escort you out, Monica interrupted gently. Your personal items will be sent to your home address. Your company devices have already been remotely locked. I watched as the realization of what was happening finally penetrated Ethan's armor. His shoulders sagged almost imperceptibly. For a fleeting moment, he looked directly at me, not with anger, as I'd expected, but with something like respect mixed with resentment. As security personnel appeared at the door, Ethan straightened his tie, nodded once to the board members, and walked out with as much dignity as the circumstances allowed. The room erupted into tense conversation the moment the door closed behind him. Board members huddled with Monica, department heads whispered urgently to one another, and, Brian, poor, loyal Brian, sat stunned in his chair, staring at the evidence still displayed on the screen. You knew? He asked me quietly. All this time? Not all this time, I answered, gathering my materials. Just the past few weeks. Once I saw the pattern, I couldn't unsee it. I told everyone he was here that morning, Brian said, his voice hollow. I saw his coat, his coffee cup. The lights were on in his office. That was by design, I said gently. You weren't the only one deceived, Brian. That was the point, to create so many witnesses to his presence that no one would question it. Priya approached us, her captain's uniform lending her an additional air of authority. You did good, sis, she said, squeezing my shoulder. Brian looked between us. I don't understand. Why would he go to such lengths? He's the CEO. He can take meetings wherever he wants. It wasn't about the meetings, Monica answered, joining our small group. It was about creating a system where his approval could be cited without him actually reviewing anything. A presence that could be invoked whenever convenient, without accountability. The real damage assessment is just beginning, she added, glancing at her phone. We're already identifying decisions that were supposedly Ethan approved that need immediate review. As the initial shock subsided, the work ahead became clear. This wasn't just about one man's deception. It was about rebuilding the integrity of an entire organization. The week after Ethan's departure was a blur of emergency board meetings, staff communications, and damage control. I barely slept, running on adrenaline and the bitter Lakefront Roasters coffee that Elin delivered directly to our crisis command center on the 32nd floor. You're the talk of the building, she told me on the third morning, setting down a tray of drinks. Some people are calling you a hero? And the others? I asked, knowing full well that exposing a beloved leader rarely earns universal praise. Elin shrugged. The others will come around when the dust settles. She wasn't wrong, but the dust kicked up by Ethan's fall took longer to settle than any of us anticipated. The story broke in Crane's Chicago business by the end of the week. CEO ousted after elaborate deception scheme. The Chicago Tribune followed with a deeper investigation. Stratagem CEO's double life raises questions about corporate oversight. Ethan's only public statement came through his attorney. Mr. Cross acknowledges certain lapses in judgment regarding his personal schedule, but categorically denies any financial impropriety or governance violations. Catherine, his wife, filed for divorce 3 days later. The real work happened behind closed doors, away from headlines. Monica assembled a task force to review every major decision attributed to Ethan over the past year. I was appointed to lead the audit, reporting directly to the interim CEO, Margaret Chen, our former COO who had always maintained a polite professional distance from Ethan's inner circle. "We need to understand how deep this goes," Margaret told me during our first one-on-one. Her office, formerly Ethan's, had been stripped of his personal touches, the space now utilitarian and focused. "This isn't a witch hunt, Naomi. This is about restoring integrity to our processes." The audit revealed a disturbing pattern. Key decisions that had been attributed to Ethan's direct approval often benefited a small circle of vendors and partners. Financial records showed consulting fees paid to Shell, companies that traced back to former colleagues from his previous firm. Strategic shifts that seemed puzzling at the time now formed a clear pattern of self-dealing and selective advantage. Most troubling were the personal stories that began to emerge as people felt safe to speak up. Janet from product development revealed how her promotion had been mysteriously blocked despite unanimous department support. "I was told Ethan had concerns about my leadership readiness," she explained during our interview. "But he never spoke to me directly, never gave me feedback or areas to improve." Ahmed from finance described presenting alternative models for the Miller acquisition. Models that would have been more advantageous to Stratagem but less favorable to the third-party advisor who later received a substantial fee. "My analysis disappeared," he said simply. "When I asked about it, I was told Ethan had reviewed everything personally and made his decision." Patterns emerged of women whose careers had stalled after declining Ethan's mentoring offers, of vendors chosen despite higher costs and lower performance, of acquisitions that seemed strategic only in hindsight, with careful narrative management. Through it all, Brian struggled the most visibly with the revelations. He had been Ethan's most vocal champion, his most loyal defender. Now he questioned everything, including his own judgment. "I feel like such a fool," he confessed one evening as we reviewed documents well past normal business hours. "I bragged about him constantly, defended him against any criticism. How did I not see it? Because he made sure you didn't," I said, passing him a container of lukewarm pad thai. "That's how these systems work, Brian. They rely on true believers who never think to question." He poked at his food without eating. "But you questioned." "Eventually," I conceded, "and only because my sister happened to be in exactly the right place at the right time. Without that coincidence, who knows how long it would have continued." The audit concluded after 6 weeks of intensive review. The report, which ran to 147 pages, documented not just Ethan's absence deception, but its consequences: financial improprieties, biased decision-making, and a corporate culture built around a carefully constructed illusion. The board accepted the report during a somber meeting that lasted well into the night. When it concluded, Margaret Chen officially assumed the role of permanent CEO, with a mandate for transparency and governance reform. "We have an opportunity here," she told the assembled executives. "Not just to correct past mistakes, but to build something better. A company where decisions are evaluated on merit, not on who claims to have been in the room." As the meeting adjourned, Monica pulled me aside. "The board has a proposal for you," she said. "A new position, Director of Risk Integrity, reporting directly to Margaret with oversight of both financial and ethical risk management." The offer was unexpected, a significant promotion with expanded scope and influence. "They were impressed by your work," Monica continued. "Not just the investigation, but your approach throughout. Methodical, fair, focused on systems rather than personalities." "I'll need to think about it," I said honestly. The past weeks had been exhausting, and part of me longed for the quiet analysis work I'd done before I became the whistleblower, before colleagues either praised me effusively or avoided eye contact in hallways. "Take the weekend," Monica advised. "But Naomi, Stratagem needs people like you, people who see patterns others miss, people with the courage to speak up." That night, I met Priya for dinner at our favorite Indian restaurant in Devon Avenue. The familiar scents of cardamom and ginger were comforting after weeks of crisis management. "So," my sister said after we'd ordered. Are you going to take the job? News traveled fast, especially in Patel family circles. I haven't decided yet. What's holding you back? Priya asked, breaking off a piece of naan bread. It's a big step up. More influence, better pay, chance to actually fix the problems you uncovered. I sighed, trying to articulate the unease I felt. What if the system can't be fixed? What if I spend years trying to build integrity into an organization that fundamentally resists it? Priya considered this, her pilot's practicality coming to the fore. Systems can change, Naomi. I've seen it in aviation. After accidents, after near misses, protocols evolve, but only if the right people insist on it. She reached into her bag and pulled out a small box. I got you something, for making it through this mess with your integrity intact. Inside was a silver charm for my bracelet, a tiny airplane engraved with two simple words, eyes forward. I looked up at my sister, feeling tears threaten for the first time since the whole ordeal began. That's what my flight instructor used to tell me when I was learning to land, Priya explained. Don't fixate on the mistakes behind you. Keep your eyes forward, or you'll never see what's coming. Monday, morning arrived with Chicago's typical April unpredictability, sunshine breaking through rain clouds, warmth wrestling with lingering winter chill. I stood at my apartment window, watching the city wake up, the silver airplane charm cool against my wrist. Eyes forward. My phone buzzed with a text from Monica. Decision time. Margaret's office, 9 a.m. I hadn't slept well, my mind churning through options and consequences. The Director of Risk Integrity role represented a chance to reshape stratagem from within, to build systems that couldn't be manipulated by charisma or intimidation. But it also meant stepping permanently into the spotlight, becoming the face of corporate accountability, rather than the quiet analyst I'd always been. By the time I reached Stratagem's glass tower, I had made my decision. Margaret Chen's office retained none of Ethan's theatrical touches. No dramatic lighting, no carefully positioned awards, no artful family photos suggesting perfect work-life balance. Instead, the space was practical and serene, with simple furnishings and a stunning view of Lake Michigan. Naomi? Margaret greeted me, rising from behind her desk. Thank you for coming in, I take it? Monica shared our proposal. She did, I confirmed, taking the offered seat. I've given it serious consideration. And? Margaret's gaze was direct but kind. I'll accept, I said, with one condition. Margaret raised an eyebrow but nodded for me to continue. The integrity of this company can't depend on any one person's courage or vigilance, I explained. We need structural safeguards, independent verification processes, anonymous reporting channels, regular external audits. The system has to be transparent and self-correcting, not reliant on whistleblowers. Margaret studied me for a long moment, then smiled. I expected nothing less from you, Naomi. Draft a proposal for these safeguards, and we'll implement them alongside your appointment. We shook hands, and just like that, my role at Stratagem transformed. The transition wasn't ceremonious. No company-wide announcement, no congratulatory champagne. Just a quiet office move to the executive floor and a calendar suddenly filled with meetings labeled Integrity Framework Development. The first months were harder than I anticipated. Despite the evidence against Ethan, pockets of resistance remained. Employees who had thrived under his leadership or benefited from his selective favoritism. The ethics police are here, I overheard one finance manager mutter when I entered the break room. His colleagues laughed nervously, falling silent when they noticed me. I poured my coffee and turned to face them. Actually, think of me more as ethics infrastructure, I said calmly. My job isn't to police you, it's to build systems that make doing the right thing the easiest path. The manager had the grace to look embarrassed. No offense intended. None taken, I replied. But I'd welcome your input on the new verification processes we're implementing. Your team will be directly affected. Small moments like these gradually shifted the atmosphere. Where suspicion existed, I offered transparency. Where resistance emerged, I invited participation. The goal wasn't to impose integrity from above, but to weave it into the company's daily operations. Brian proved an unexpected ally. Having been Ethan's most vocal supporter, made his conversion to champion of the new systems particularly powerful. I was the perfect mark, he explained during one of our implementation meetings. Eager for approval, happy to spread the gospel of Ethan without questioning. If I can change my perspective, anyone can. 6 months into my new role, we launched the Proof Not Presence policy. Any decision citing executive input had to be documented and verifiable. No more Ethan said or Margaret approved without an auditable trail of actual review. The policy name became something of a company mantra, appearing on coffee mugs and laptop stickers throughout the building. What started as accountability evolved into a point of pride, a visible symbol of Stratagem's commitment to substance over appearance. Not everyone embraced the changes. 3 senior executives left within the year, citing philosophical differences with the new direction. Several long-standing vendor relationships ended when our enhanced due diligence revealed concerning connections or performance issues previously overlooked. The most satisfying transformations were the human ones. Janet from product development received her long-delayed promotion and was now leading our fastest-growing division. Ahmed from finance headed a new analytical team specifically tasked with challenging conventional wisdom and presenting alternative approaches. Women and minorities who had been quietly sidelined under the previous regime found their careers accelerating as legitimate merit finally trumped superficial factors. "You've changed the chemistry of this place," Monica observed one evening as we reviewed the quarterly ethics report. "It's not just the policies, it's the expectations. People believe integrity matters here. Now." "Most people," I corrected her, thinking of the resistance we still occasionally encountered. "Progress isn't perfection," she reminded me. "It's direction." 1 year after Ethan's departure, Margaret called an all-hands meeting, not at the Wabash executive loft where Ethan had fallen, but in our own building's auditorium. The symbolism wasn't lost on anyone. "1 year ago," she began, addressing the assembled staff, "Stratagem faced a crisis of integrity. Today, we're stronger for having confronted it honestly." She shared the results of our transformation: client trust at an all-time high, employee satisfaction improving quarter over quarter, and, most tellingly, issue reporting up by 215%, while actual violations decreased by 67%. "People feel safe highlighting concerns," Margaret explained, "which means we catch problems earlier and with less drama." As she spoke, I scanned the audience. Brian sat in the front row, nodding along, occasionally making notes. Janet and Ahmed sat with their respective teams, embodying the career advancement that honest evaluation made possible. Even the finance manager from the break room seemed engaged, the initial resistance replaced by cautious support. After the meeting, employees lingered in groups, discussing the presentation and the year's changes. I was about to slip away when Brian caught up with me. "Got a minute?" he asked, unusually hesitant. We found a quiet corner away from the dispersing crowd. "I've been meaning to say this for a while," he began, fidgeting with his tie. "I'm sorry for how blindly I promoted Ethan's myths, for making your job harder by being his biggest cheerleader." "Brian, that's—" "Please let me finish," he interrupted gently. "I've done a lot of thinking about why I was so susceptible, why I needed his approval so badly." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "I think I mistook charisma for character, confused being seen with being valued. It's embarrassing to admit how much I structured my professional identity around reflecting his light. The vulnerability in his admission touched me. We all have blind spots, Brian. The question is whether we learn from them." "That's just it," he said, his expression clearing. "I have learned. I'm actually grateful, in a way. Not for the deception, but for the wake-up call." He smiled ruefully. "I'm a better marketing officer, now that I'm selling something I actually believe in. A company with real integrity, not just a carefully managed image." As Brian walked away, I felt something settle within me, a confirmation that the difficult path had been the right one. The humiliation Ethan suffered that day in the conference room had been instant, but the restoration of the company, of colleagues like Brian, and of my own sense of purpose had been gradual and far more meaningful. 18 months after Ethan's departure, I received an unexpected email from a journalist at the Wall Street Journal. She was working on a feature about corporate governance reforms and wanted to interview me about Stratagem's transformation. "Your proof not presence framework has attracted attention," the email stated. "Companies facing similar challenges are looking to your model." I forwarded the message to Margaret and Monica, unsure how to proceed. Stratagem had deliberately kept a low profile during our rebuilding phase, focusing on substance rather than publicity. "Take the interview," Margaret replied almost immediately. "It's time to share what we've learned." Monica's response followed minutes later. "Agreed. This isn't about rehashing the scandal, it's about showcasing the solution." 2 days later, I sat across from Eliza Warner, a veteran business journalist known for her incisive reporting on corporate ethics. We met at a quiet cafe near Millennium Park, away from the corporate environment. "Thank you for agreeing to this," Eliza began, setting up her recorder. Let's start with the obvious question. How does a company rebuild trust after such a fundamental breach? I considered carefully before answering. By acknowledging that trust isn't rebuilt through declarations or PR campaigns, it's rebuilt through consistent, verifiable actions over time. And the specifics at Stratagem? We implemented what we call the triple V approach, I explained. Visibility into decision processes, verification of executive claims, and voice for employees who spot inconsistencies. The goal was to create a system where integrity is structural, not dependent on individual heroics. Eliza nodded, making notes. You've been described as a reluctant whistleblower. Would you agree with that characterization? The question gave me pause. I was reluctant, I admitted. Not because I questioned what I'd discovered, but because I understood the cost, to the company, to colleagues, to relationships I valued. Whistleblowing isn't something anyone should enter into lightly. And yet you proceeded. Because some costs are higher than others. The cost of silence would have been our collective integrity. That's too high a price for comfort. The interview continued for over an hour, covering the technical aspects of our reforms and the human dimension of organizational change. Throughout, Eliza returned to what she called the courage question. What makes someone speak up when silence would be easier? I don't think of it as courage exactly, I told her toward the end. It's more about alignment. When your professional responsibilities align with your personal values, the difficult choice becomes the only choice. The article appeared 3 weeks later. After the fall, how one company built integrity into its DNA. The piece was thoughtful and balanced, focusing not on the scandal, but on the reconstruction that followed. Stratagem was portrayed not as a cautionary tale, but as a template for reform. I'm impressed, Monica said, stopping by my office with the print edition. She captured the substance without sensationalizing the story. That was the goal, I agreed, relieved by the article's tone. Focus on the solutions, not just the problems. You come across well, she added with a slight smile. The reluctant reformer who changed a corporate culture. I grimaced at the characterization. That wasn't my intention. Intention and impact aren't always aligned, Monica observed. Your story resonates because it's authentic. You weren't seeking the spotlight. It found you through circumstance and choice. The article generated more attention than any of us anticipated. Requests for speaking engagements and consulting inquiries flooded in. Margaret and the board saw strategic value in sharing our approach, positioning Stratagem as a thought leader in corporate governance. Select a few key opportunities, Margaret advised. But remember, your primary role is here, building and maintaining our own systems. I chose carefully. A keynote at a risk management conference in Boston, a panel discussion at Northwestern's Kellogg School of Management, a workshop for corporate ethics officers from various industries. Each engagement forced me to articulate not just what we had done, but why it mattered. At Kellogg, a student asked the question that had lingered in my mind. What happened to Ethan Cross after he left Stratagem? I had deliberately avoided following Ethan's trajectory, focusing instead on the company's recovery. But public records and business news were unavoidable. Mr. Cross faced both professional consequences and personal fallout, I answered carefully. The Securities and Exchange Commission investigated certain financial decisions made under his leadership. He reached a settlement without admitting wrongdoing. As for his current activities, I believe he's working with a private equity firm in a non-executive capacity. What I didn't mention, what felt too personal to share, were the occasional sightings, reported by Chicago colleagues. Ethan at a downtown restaurant, noticeably aged. Ethan at a charity event, standing at the edges rather than the center. Ethan with significantly reduced stature, the magnetic aura dimmed by consequence. I took no pleasure in these reports. The goal had never been his humiliation, but the company's integrity. His fall was a necessary consequence, not the primary objective. On the anniversary of the Wall Street Journal article, I received a small package at my office. Inside was a handwritten note from Janet in product development. 2 years ago, I was ready to leave Stratagem. My career had stalled for reasons I couldn't understand, and I blamed myself for not being leadership material. Now I run a division that's expanding globally. The changes you initiated didn't just expose one man's deception. They created space for people like me to thrive on merit alone. Thank you for showing us what real presence means. Attached to the note was a custom pin designed by her team, a small silver badge emblazoned with proof, not presence. I I pinned it to my blazer lapel, touched by the gesture and reminded of why the difficult path had been necessary. True presence, genuine engagement, verifiable actions, consistent integrity couldn't be faked or manufactured. It had to be lived, day after day, choice after choice. The transformation of stratagem continued, not as a dramatic redemption story, but as steady, incremental improvement. Systems were refined, processes adjusted, feedback incorporated. The scandal that once defined us became merely a chapter in a longer narrative of evolution. "You know what I find most remarkable?" Brian said during one of our quarterly review meetings. "How quickly the extraordinary becomes ordinary. The transparency that seemed revolutionary 2 years ago is just how we work now." He was right. What began as crisis response had normalized into corporate culture. New employees who joined after Ethan's departure couldn't imagine operating any other way. That was the true victory. Not the exposure of a deception, but the construction of a reality where such deceptions couldn't take root. 3 years to the day after Ethan's downfall, I found myself back at Lakefront Roasters. The morning ritual that had once been interrupted by Priya's fateful call had long since resumed its comforting rhythm. "The usual?" Elin asked, though she was already preparing my latte. "Please, and maybe one of those almond croissants." "Special occasion?" she inquired, bagging the pastry. I smiled, fingering the small silver airplane charm that still hung from my bracelet. "Anniversary of sorts?" "Must be a good one. You're actually taking a breakfast break instead of running straight to the office." "Learning balance," I admitted. Slowly. The truth was, I'd deliberately carved out this moment of reflection. 3 years felt significant, long enough to assess the lasting impact of changes made in crisis, to see what had rooted deeply and what had withered without constant attention. I took my coffee to a small table by the window, watching Chicago's financial district pulse with morning energy. 3 years ago, I'd stood in this very spot, grappling with the implications of what my sister had just told me. Now I sat with a different kind of awareness. Not the adrenaline rush of uncovering deception, but the quiet satisfaction of sustained transformation. My phone buzzed with a calendar notification. Board strategy session, 10 a.m. No longer an anxiety-inducing prospect, these quarterly meetings had become collaborative exchanges where diverse perspectives genuinely shaped company direction. As I gathered my things to leave, the cafe door opened and a familiar face appeared, one I hadn't seen in person for nearly 3 years. Ethan Cross looked different. The impeccable suits and calculated charm had been replaced by something more subdued. He still carried himself with confidence, but it was tempered now, less performative. He hadn't noticed me yet, focused on ordering his coffee. For a moment, I considered slipping out unnoticed. Our paths had no reason to cross anymore. He had moved on to a small advisory role at a firm in the suburbs, according to industry gossip. Stratagem had long since stabilized under Margaret's leadership, the scandal fading into institutional memory. But running felt dishonest somehow, contradictory to everything I'd advocated. Presence meant facing reality, not avoiding it. "Hello, Ethan," I said, approaching the counter. He turned, recognition followed by visible surprise crossing his features. "Naomi, I didn't expect—" He stopped, recalibrating. "It's been a while." "It has," I agreed. An awkward silence stretched between us, filled with unspoken history. "How is stratagem?" he finally asked, accepting his coffee from Elin, who watched our interaction with undisguised curiosity. "Flourishing," I answered honestly. "The proof not presence framework has become industry recognized. Margaret is leading a major expansion into Europe." He nodded, absorbing this. "I read about your governance model in the Harvard Business Review. Impressive work." "Thank you." I hesitated, then added, "It's not about any one person. That was always the point." A ghost of his old smile appeared. "Including you? The architect of the new system?" "Especially me," I confirmed. "The framework is designed to function regardless of who's in any particular role." Ethan glanced at his watch. "I have a meeting across town. But it's good to see you, Naomi, despite everything." As he turned to leave, I felt a question rise that had lingered in my mind for years. "Ethan?" He paused at the door. "Why the elaborate deception? You were the CEO. You could have delegated openly, taken meetings anywhere you chose." He considered the question carefully. "It started small," he finally said. "A convenient fiction to be in 2 places at once. Then it became useful. Power without accountability is seductive. The admission held no defensiveness, just a simple recognition of human frailty. For what it's worth, he added, what you built from the ashes is better than what I created. Stronger, more real. He gave a slight nod. Good luck with the board meeting. After he left, I remained standing by the counter, processing the unexpected encounter. There was no satisfaction in seeing Ethan diminished, no vindication in his acknowledgement, only a certain melancholy at the waist, the talent and vision that had been corrupted by the allure of unchecked influence. That looked intense, Ellen commented, wiping down the counter. Old colleague, I explained vaguely. Figured. Financial district's a small world. She studied me for a moment. You okay? I considered the question. Yes, I realized, somewhat surprised by the certainty I felt. Actually, I am. The encounter with Ethan provided unexpected closure, not because he'd sought forgiveness or offered dramatic apologies, but because the company we'd both shaped in different ways had transcended either of our individual contributions. Stratagem had evolved beyond personality cults and charismatic leadership to something more sustainable. When I arrived at the office, the day proceeded with its usual rhythm. The board meeting was productive, focused on expansion strategy rather than crisis management. Afterward, I caught up with Janet, whose division had recently closed a major international contract. Heard you're being considered for the executive VP position, I told her as we walked back to our offices. She smiled, confidence radiating from her in a way that would have been unthinkable 3 years ago. Final interviews next week. Whatever happens, I'm grateful for the fair shot. You earned it, I reminded her. We all did, she countered. The whole company earned this second chance. That evening, I met Priya for our monthly dinner. My sister had recently been promoted to director of flight operations, her career soaring as steadily as the planes she commanded. So, she said after we'd ordered, 3-year anniversary of the great exposure. How's it feel? Complicated, I admitted, sharing the unexpected encounter with Ethan. Seeing him today made me realize how completely we've moved on. The company doesn't revolve around him anymore, not even as a cautionary tale. That's success, Priya observed. When the system works without needing constant vigilance against one specific threat. I suppose it is. I twisted the airplane charm on my bracelet. Eyes forward, right? Always, she agreed, though sometimes it's worth a glance back to appreciate the distance traveled. Later that night, I stood at my apartment window, gazing at Chicago's glittering skyline. The city stretched before me, countless windows illuminated with stories I'd never know, triumphs and failures, deceptions and truths, all playing out behind glass barriers. 3 years ago, I'd been thrust into a spotlight I never sought, forced to choose between comfortable silence and difficult truth. The path hadn't been easy, but looking back, I couldn't imagine choosing differently. The humiliation Ethan suffered that day in the conference room had been instant, but the dignity restored to the company, to colleagues whose potential had been artificially limited, and to my own sense of purpose, had been lasting. 5 years after the events that transformed Stratagem, I sat in a classroom at Northwestern University facing 30 graduate students in the Ethics and Leadership program. Professor Abernathy had invited me as a guest lecturer for her case study series on corporate integrity. Ms. Patel, before we dive into the technical aspects of your governance framework, one student asked, I'm curious about the personal cost. What was the hardest part of becoming a whistleblower? The question was familiar. I'd heard variations of it countless times at conferences and panels, but something about the earnest curiosity in the student's expression made me pause and consider more deeply. The hardest part wasn't the initial decision, I finally answered. It was navigating the aftermath. When your identity becomes defined by a single action, when colleagues view you differently, when you're expected to be either a crusader or a traitor with no room for the complicated human reality in between. The classroom fell silent. The students' usual note-taking paused as they absorbed this. But here's what I've learned, I continued. That moment of exposure wasn't the end of the story. It was barely the beginning. The real work happened in the years that followed, in the daily choices that built something new from the wreckage. As the session concluded, Professor Abernathy approached with a warm smile. That was exactly what these future leaders needed to hear, she said. Not just systems and frameworks, but the human dimension of ethical leadership. I'm not sure I qualify as an ethical leader, I admitted. I just did what the situation demanded. That's precisely what makes you one, she countered. Leadership isn't about seeking moral spotlights. It's about making difficult choices when circumstances require them. Her words stayed with me as I left campus, walking along the lakefront where spring had finally asserted itself after Chicago's punishing winter. The air carried the promise of renewal, of growth emerging from dormant ground. My phone buzzed with a message from Margaret. Decision official. Board approved unanimously. We announce tomorrow. I smiled, knowing what the message meant. After 5 years of steady leadership, Margaret was stepping down as CEO to join the board of directors. Her successor had been the subject of intense speculation for months. What few people knew was that I had been offered the position first. The conversation had taken place in Margaret's office 3 weeks earlier, with the same lake view that had witnessed my acceptance of the risk integrity role years before. "You're the natural choice," Margaret had insisted. "You embody the values that define the new stratagem." I had been genuinely surprised by the offer. "Margaret, I've never aspired to be CEO." "Which is precisely why you'd excel at it," she'd countered. "Leadership isn't about aspiration, it's about service and capability." I had asked for time to consider, though in my heart I already knew my answer. The following week, I'd return to her office with my decision. "I'm declining the CEO position," I'd told her directly. "But I have an alternative proposal." Margaret had listened intently as I outlined my vision. A new corporate structure where the Chief Integrity Officer would serve as an equal counterweight to the CEO, with independent authority and direct board access. Not just an ethics watchdog, but a fundamental redesign of executive power distribution. "You want to institutionalize the check and balance," Margaret had observed. "Exactly. Not dependent on any individual's courage or position, but built into the corporate DNA." My phone buzzed again with a follow-up message from Margaret. "Janet handling the transition beautifully. Press response to dual leadership model overwhelmingly positive." Janet, once sidelined under Ethan's leadership, would become Stratagem's new CEO tomorrow. I would assume the role of Chief Integrity Officer with equal compensation, board representation, and organizational authority. The first corporation of our size to implement such a model. The announcement had already been made internally, generating excitement and some inevitable confusion about how the dual leadership would function in practice. But the principles were clear: strategic vision balanced with integrity oversight, execution tempered by ethical consideration, power distributed rather than concentrated. That evening, a small gathering assembled at Monica's condo overlooking the Chicago River. The informal celebration included those who had been central to Stratagem's transformation: Margaret, Janet, Brian, and a few others who had stood firm during the turbulent aftermath of Ethan's departure. "To new beginnings," Monica toasted, raising her glass. "And to the road that brought us here." "Speaking of roads," Brian interjected, "did you hear about Ethan?" The name still caused a momentary pause in conversation, though without the tension it once provoked. "He's starting a governance consulting firm," Brian continued, "specializing in executive accountability structures." Janet arched an eyebrow. "Ironic. Or fitting," Margaret suggested. "Sometimes those who failed most spectacularly have the most valuable insights." The conversation drifted to other topics: Janet's vision for international expansion, the challenges of the dual leadership model, the industry recognition Stratagem had received for its innovative governance approach. Throughout the evening, I found myself observing more than participating, struck by how completely this group had transcended the crisis that initially brought them together. Later, as the gathering dispersed, Monica joined me on her balcony. The Chicago skyline sparkled before us, a tapestry of lights against the night sky. "Penny for your thoughts," she offered. "I was just thinking about presence," I admitted. Real presence. Not the illusion Ethan created, but genuine engagement with reality, facing consequences, building from truth, showing up authentically, day after day. Monica nodded thoughtfully. "The corporate world fetishizes charismatic leadership, the bigger-than-life figure who bends reality through sheer force of personality. What we've built is the antithesis of that myth." "Do you think it will last?" I asked. "Beyond our tenure, I mean. That's always the test, isn't it? Whether the changes we make outlive our direct influence." She smiled. "But I like our odds. We're not building on personality. We're building on principles." The next morning dawned clear and bright. I dressed carefully for the press conference where Janet would be introduced as CEO and our dual leadership model officially unveiled to the public. As I fastened my silver airplane charm bracelet, my phone rang with Priya's familiar tone. "Big day," my sister said by way of greeting. "How are you feeling?" "Ready," I answered truthfully. "This feels right. Not just for me, but for what stratagem needs to become. From reluctant whistleblower to corporate structural reformer. Priya mused. Quite the journey, sis. A journey with excellent co-pilots, I countered, making her laugh. The press conference proceeded smoothly. Janet articulated her vision for Stratagem's future with the confidence and clarity that had propelled her rise. When my turn came, I explained the rationale behind our governance innovation, the separation of execution from oversight, the structural distribution of power, the institutionalization of integrity. This isn't about personalities, I emphasized to the assembled journalists. It's about recognizing that corporate leadership requires both visionary direction and ethical boundaries. Neither should be subordinate to the other. Afterward, as we navigated the customary handshakes and congratulations, a young reporter approached me with a final question. Ms. Patel, looking back at the crisis that began this transformation, what would you say is the most important lesson? I considered. The journey, from that moment in Lakefront Roasters when my sister's call changed everything, to this day of new beginnings and structural innovation. From the instant humiliation Ethan suffered when his deception was exposed, to the lasting dignity restored through years of intentional rebuilding. The most important lesson, I answered, is that truth doesn't humiliate. It illuminates. When we stop confusing appearances with integrity, when we value proof over presence, we protect not just reputations, but people's futures. As the reporter nodded and made notes, I glanced around the room. Brian stood chatting with board members, his marketing expertise now grounded in authentic value rather than manufactured image. Monica conversed with industry analysts, explaining the legal framework, underpinning our governance model. Janet accepted congratulations with the poise of someone who had earned her position through merit rather than favoritism. And somewhere in Chicago, Ethan Cross was beginning his own new chapter, perhaps finding redemption by helping others avoid the patterns that had been his downfall. The humiliation he suffered that day in the conference room had been instant and complete. But the dignity restored to the company, to the colleagues whose potential had been artificially limited, and to my own sense of purpose, had been lasting and transformative. In the end, this wasn't about catching a man in a lie. It was about proving something bigger. Presence is not proof. Proof is proof. When we stop confusing appearances with integrity, we protect not just reputations, but people's futures. And that's the lesson I carry forward. Truth doesn't humiliate. It illuminates.